Ian, good afternoon, your time.
Yes, good.
I'm just going to get everything set up. We are live right now, so we'll get started in just a minute for everyone who's watching. Just give one more minute here. And we are just still waiting for David, Ian, and then we can get started.
David's unwell, so I'm going to cover for him this evening.
Okay.
So yes, we're probably not waiting for anyone now. I see the Joe's there.
We'll just give one more minute and we'll get started. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, regardless of where you are. Thank you for joining this webinar on leadership of volunteer policing. I'm Ben Haiman. I serve as the president for the Volunteer Law Enforcement Officers Association and joined by colleagues here today. I see that we have many folks that are on the line as attendees. As you have questions throughout the day, feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function in the bottom to get questions to our panel members. We want to thank you very much for taking a few moments to listen in to this conversation. And I want to thank Ian for his work in research related to volunteer policing, but also convening this conversation here today with Ross and Joe. This is another opportunity to learn more about the distinguishing and unique factors of volunteer policing and what it takes to successfully lead and run volunteer policing organizations. Ian and his scholars have done a lot of work and research in connecting the volunteer policing world, and VLEOA is delighted to be partners with Ian. Ian, I'll turn it over to you to introduce others and really appreciate you leading this forum here today.
No, thank you very much, Ben, and thank you for everyone for dialing in. If I briefly introduce my two illustrious colleagues, both of whom have a huge level of experience in terms of the issues of leading in volunteer policing, given that they have both had long and distinguished careers leading in volunteer policing. So, firstly, if I introduce Professor Ross Wolfe, who is, I believe, until recently, or I'm never quite sure whether you've retired or are imminently about to retire, Ross, but as uh, Chief Deputy and the lead for the Reserve Police in Orange County Sheriff's Office in Florida, and also, of course, a former president of this association, and also Assistant Chief Joe Clymer from Phoenix PD, who is the lead for their reserve program down there, which I've had the huge pleasure to visit a couple of times now, and have almost got used to the weather now and then.
He's a little surprised when it rains out here. So it's a great honor to be here today.
Well, thank you both. So we were meant to be joined by a fourth panelist, David Pedrick from the UK, but unfortunately he's unwell today. So I'm going to kick off and I'll just add a little bit to what I was going to say about the general research picture around volunteer leadership by also saying one or two further remarks around the UK picture as well. So I'm now going to try to do the technical point. I do have a few slides. So if I are we successfully sharing there? Excellent. So if I okay, can everyone see the slides? Okay.
I can
I'm
see
not
him,
sure.
Ian. Yep.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to make them full screen. The technical expertise has left me, but hopefully they're okay for people to see anyway.
Ian,
So
if you
basically,
put
just
it in
yep,
slideshow mode, and then you'll have to reshare your screen. Or just leave it as is. You can see fairly clearly.
right. Yeah, let's just go with how it is. I'm not quite sure what my computer seems to be doing strange things when I try to make it for full screen view. So I think much of this will be familiar to lots of people in the audience who have that experience themselves around leadership issues and volunteer and reserve programs. But I think one of the key messages is that whilst reserve officers, whilst volunteer police have much in common with their paid service sworn colleagues in the agency, they also have some things which are very distinctly different. It is a fundamentally different experience being a part-time volunteer member of a law enforcement organization than it is being a, for example, full-time sworn member of the same organization. Your relationship with the organization and with the people in it is inevitably differently shaped. You have often a very demanding professional working life outside of policing. You are often in and around policing very much more on a part-time basis. The motivations for why people join and why they stay as volunteer and reserve officers are distinct to those that attract people into the regular sworn service. And one of the truths which I think is often said about volunteer personnel in any organisation is that once you take out the payment component, then everything else matters more. So those whole things about morale and appreciation and recognition and communication and engagement, which are really important for paid service personnel, are the lifeblood when you look at a volunteer cohort of officers, because if you don't get those things right, then those people won't be there anymore. So it's fundamentally not the case that you can just apply your human resources, your leadership approaches to volunteer people in the organization in the same way as you would to your paid service colleagues. The The research which has been undertaken in and around policing suggests that having volunteers in leadership roles, so I know in lots of reserve models in the US, in the context of lots of the auxiliary models in Canada, several of the European models, certainly here in the UK with our special constabulary, at least in England and Wales, you have ranked roles, you have promoted roles of volunteers who provide leadership as volunteers to the volunteer peers. There are major advantages of doing that. The obvious ones just being that shared lived experience and authenticity. You have leaders who have been voluntary within the organization themselves. They've got that shared experience with those volunteers that are leading there on the front line. And if it is well set up, those roles are empowered, they're sensibly supported by paid personnel, so we don't expect too much of part-time volunteer leaders who have hugely busy lives doing all sorts of other things. There appears to be advantage in having some level of structured leadership within the volunteer police cohort itself, rather than relying on paid service personnel to be all of your leadership structure. And I think we just don't pay enough attention to getting the leadership around volunteer police right. We, when we talk about leadership in policing, we don't talk very much about the volunteer element of it. And when we talk about developing and having sustainable programs around volunteer police, we don't focus enough on just how critically important from top to bottom of leadership structures the leadership model is. So just to give a really quick sense of the range of things we I guess, are looking at when we've done elements of research into what do volunteer leaders do, what does leadership around volunteer police do. I think the first column there is very much that downing in leadership. It's the support, supervision, welfare, well-being of those volunteers who are out there policing within the organisation. So providing day-to-day support and supervision, ensuring volunteer welfare, well-being, keeping in touch, communicating, and helping to provide that structure and content on the ground in terms of training newer officers and training developing standards around the cohort of volunteer police as a whole. There's then a leadership role, which is often, I guess, maybe more the remit of people a little more senior within the organisation, of just making sure that the volunteer deployment and utilisation is right and works within the agency as a whole, so that the reserve component, the volunteer component is well integrated operationally. It doesn't sit on the outside of that. It works well with it. It dovetails well. There's no sort of breakdowns in the operational coherence between reserve and regular or sworn service. And then I think there's the column which we often neglect around volunteer policing, and that may be why many of our programs are in the strategic position that they're in, which is quite vulnerable, is that there's also a leadership role here in that strategy, vision, and looking to the further future. So making sure that volunteering is designed into the organization inherently from the top, that there's that cascade of what are the law enforcement organizational priorities into what is your reserve unit, your auxiliary unit doing, and that this is seen as an integral, valued part of policing and of the police organization as a whole, that chief officers, that senior personnel within the organization are valuing, prioritizing, and recognizing the reserve function, the special constabulary function, that it's resourced and sustainable, and that somebody is planning what the need is in the future, that the reserve unit we have now may well not be the reserve unit we need in 5 or 10 years' time. So it's understanding those strategic challenges within the organization. Looking at the research we've done in the UK, we found a lot of tension sometimes in how different leadership roles fit and work together. So to describe that system in the UK, you often have a strategic senior leadership figure around this agenda who may well be at a chief officer rank or what we call a superintendent rank. So a senior, often police officer who has a strategic responsibility for the program. You have the volunteer leadership, which often in the UK involves a special chief officer and other senior ranked volunteer officers. And then you have a coordination staff, which might have, in our UK language or England and Wales language, a citizens and policing manager, a special constabulary coordinator, those sorts of roles. One of the challenges we find is that these things aren't always mapped well to one another, that is not always obvious who calls the shots and how the different dynamics of those roles come together. So picking up on some of that, and this is primarily our research here in the UK, what are some of the common leadership problems we found around our volunteer police here? Firstly, and this is very much for special constabularies within England and Wales, but it would, I suspect this applies in lots of other contexts too. It's quite hard to be visible and connected when you're looking across a big cohort of part-time volunteers spread across the agency, some of whom may well only volunteer early on a Sunday morning and others who may only come out on a Tuesday afternoon. It it can be extremely difficult compared to if you're a regular paid service sergeant or inspector and you have your team neatly in the briefing room and they're all paid to be there in the same spot. Communication, team dynamics are a very different thing than when you're dealing with a remote, spread, part-time volunteer workforce. So I think that basic visibility and connection is often found to be a real challenge. We find that with volunteer leaders, there can be problems, and this very much isn't criticizing people who are doing this as part-time volunteers amidst the rest of life, but often people find times with pressures and other things where actually that leadership becomes a bit absent. It's quite difficult to commit the time. So volunteer officers are out there and feel that they very rarely see their volunteer leadership, that connection starts to break down. On the flip side of that, we also see cases in the UK of almost an overcommitment or excessive expectations. So where part-time volunteer leaders are expected to be on the end of a phone 24/7, attending daytime meetings, out connecting with a volunteer workforce through the night, and clearly that puts unreasonable burdens on people. We have problems in the UK around stagnation, around the sense of people just being in volunteer roles sometimes for a very, very long time. We also have problems, which is particularly around that paid service warden, officer, coordinator type roles of a lot of churn where people aren't in their posts for very long. So we have both of those problems in terms of succession and stability. As I touched on before, we often have a bit of a strategic leadership void. So there are people looking after the what's happening this weekend and what's happening with that particular volunteer. We maybe have less focus and less attention on the where does this program need to be in 2 years' time? What's our strategy for shifting the demographic of recruitment? How do we respond to this new policing challenge? All of those sorts of bigger picture leadership elements. And we find there's often a lack of basic structure around appointments and role definitions and the training of leaders and some of the processes which sit around that. And back to that dynamics between the different roles, there can be challenges of just an ambiguity of status, recognition, and respect around volunteer leaders. So they may carry the same rank as a paid service sworn colleague, but are they the same? Where do they fit within the organization? Other times when there's quite an ambiguity of who these people are and who they aren't. On the flip side, just quickly, some good practice points to pick up from what we've seen, and I think this is probably echoed the first point in what Ross will say and very much what Joe will say. Having a presence at the top table of the organization for the reserve program, for the volunteer program is really important. When you look in the UK at those special constabularies where a chief officer figure is regularly in contact with what we call our chief constable, our chief of police, where there's a dialogue about the volunteer special constable program at that senior strategic level, it makes all the difference to where the agency sits. So if you've got that person who sits on the top corridor, sits on the chief's meetings, that sort of presence is really helpful for making sure that the program is sustained and integrated and valued in the agency. I touched on policy and processes. We do still, and I know this is a 21st century, we do still have cases around our volunteer special constabulary where who's appointed is a sort of tap on the shoulder and do you want to do it next, or a little bit of the people producing strings of mates into the different appointments. So what works really well is where you have a proper formalized appointment process, which often reflects a lot of what's more broadly within the agency. You have a proper model for inducting leaders, a structured approach to training them, and you have some level of process around performance and indeed dealing with gaps in performance around your volunteer leadership. And you have ways of terminating and moving on if that's what's required. If you don't have those components in place, what often happens is that things get stuck. We often find in the UK you end up with restructuring your volunteer leadership rather than addressing performance issues within it. As I said, we often lack just what I call a sort of wiring, a clarity of who is responsible for what, who calls what shots, who owns what budget, who's responsible for what personnel. So if you have a volunteer leadership structure which involves volunteers themselves and senior sworn colleagues and police staff members, and you just need to be clear that it's written down who does what and how those people most effectively dovetail and work together. Achieving visibility and seniority is challenging, but it's really important for people to have that visible leadership. Managing succession, we often have real difficulties that somebody's been our special chief officer for years and years, and they maybe don't feel like they want to continue forever, but it's not obvious where the next person is coming from. In the same instance, we sometimes get stuck in situations where someone's been in the top job for 20 years and effectively blocked it for other people. So it's about managing those processes effectively, broadening appeal and accessibility. Frankly, pretty much all of our volunteer leadership at certainly a senior level in the UK is male. It all, dare I say, looks and feels quite the same in some ways. Many of those males are white males in the 50s at a certain stage of life professionally and whatever else. And none of that is a critique of them. It's just a reflection that broadening that appeal and accessibility can strengthen the volunteer picture as a whole. And I think what I touched on, recognition, respect, security. So if you're having volunteer leaders and you're giving them a senior role to do, they need to be recognized for what they are within the agency. They need to be respected for their leadership, and there needs to be a sensible security and stability around their role. So yes, it remains an under-researched area, but I think one where we would very much encourage people to think more about and to develop this as a critical part of developing the sustainability of the volunteer programs as a whole. So I will now stop sharing and move on, I think, to Professor Wolf next, who is probably going to talk in less abstract terms and more personal terms about his experience and take on actually being a leader in volunteer policing.
Thank you, Iain. First of all, can you hear me okay? Great. Um, Thank you, Iain, for first of all organizing this virtual gathering on leadership and volunteer policing. I also want to take a quick minute, if I can, to also thank all the volunteer police, policing volunteers, full-time police, community policing participants that are on the call. I know we have what may be a record-breaking number of people on this webinar, so thank you all for participating. I also wanted to thank my good colleague, Joe Klima, for bringing his experience and expertise to this discussion, and I look forward to hearing from you, Joe, in just a minute. By way of introduction, let me start out by saying I come into this conversation wearing two hats, or mostly wearing two hats. I'm an academic leader. I've studied policing and policing organizations and volunteer policing as part of my academic and scholarship. But as Iain mentioned, I very recently retired from the Orange County Sheriff's Office. As of February 2nd of this year, I hung up my spurs, as it were, and am no longer Reserve Chief Deputy with Orange County. I just found that my paying career was getting too much in the way of my non-paying career, and I had to have something give up, and I certainly couldn't give up my paying career. So that's how that happened, and it has been one of the busiest times in my life the past couple of years, holding two separate leadership positions in two major organizations. But I can say that it's also been some of the best times in my career that I've had. So I'm going to miss being in policing, but I'm still going to be very involved, and I'm looking forward to continuing our academic research, review, and scholarship of volunteer policing. So over my time that I've served with the Sheriff's Office, which has been about 34 years, I've worked with multiple sheriffs. Multiple senior command staff have been assigned to being liaisons for our unit. And I got to say that each of them view volunteer policing differently. No two have ever been the same. Some saw reserves or volunteer police as very much a strategic asset and a complement to the agency. Others, I think, saw them as a necessary supplement or possibly even viewed volunteer police with some caution. And I think that that variation in the leadership really matters. It matters how the volunteer police unit actually functions on the ground based on how the senior leadership was supports or lacks support for the unit. I maybe should take a minute just to lay down some quick definitions or maybe lack of definitions. When we talk about volunteer policing, we're generally referring to things in the US that we call reserves, auxiliaries, some other unpaid or maybe minimally paid officers who have some level of law enforcement authority. And I think you all will agree that right away that definition points to a challenge that there is no single shared meaning of what a volunteer police officer is. And that creates problems for us even in our own jurisdictions, because often our communities don't have a good grasp of what we're talking about or even understand that that volunteer police exist. I've had many chiefs, many sheriffs, many full-time supervisors, and even the average community member who are surprised to learn that we have volunteer policing, maybe, or that if they were aware we had volunteer police, that it is neither something new nor is it something rare in the United States or around the world. Volunteers have been a part of policing for as long as formal organizations in policing have existed. And the question really isn't whether volunteer policing exists, it's how it's structured, how it's led, and how it's governed that makes each of these units successful. And so I think it's important as we talk about leadership in volunteer units, we have those broad definitions first. As I said, volunteer policing is not uniquely American. It's around the world, and I know that we have a lot of our viewers today who are from organizations around the world, and things that we say, Joe and I say about our organizations here in the U.S. may not exactly fit something that you know in your organization, but I bet that you can relate to it. I bet it's something that you understand and can at least empathize with us on if we're talking about problems. So. In my agency in Central Florida, reserve deputies have been utilized for lots of things like large-scale emergencies, um, um, shootings, responding to shootings, but also for things like fairs, parades, community events. So we run the gamut just like full-time police officers do. During the day, a full-time police officer may respond to the proverbial cat up the tree call. And the next call they get is a hostage situation at a bank. You just never know. And the reserves respond to those things here in Central Florida, as they do in Joe's agency as well. In agencies like Orange County and like Phoenix, volunteer officers are fully sworn. They perform many of the same duties as full-time deputies, but there are other jurisdictions here and internationally where they have more limited authority and may focus more on visibility rather than enforcement. And I would like to say actually that visibility is a key part of many volunteer units, even those like Joe's and mine in Phoenix and in Orange County, but that we add a lot more to it beyond that with the additional training and authority that we have. So the key point is variation, training, authority, supervision, and integration of volunteers really differ widely. There's no single model, and that variation is good in many ways, but it also creates confusion. So, from my experience, volunteers come from basically three different groups, the volunteer police. In my agency, a large number are retired full-time officers, and they come with decades of experience usually and continue to serve their communities as volunteers. Another group that I often see are those very early in their careers or those that are just getting ready to start out and they want to see if policing is the right career for them, and often move from a volunteer policing role into a full-time role. And then there's this third group that is not what a lot of people know about volunteer policing, and that is these are professionals who are in other jobs, they have other lives, who simply want to give back in some way and serve their community and find the role of being a volunteer police officer. It fits that need that they have in their lives to be someone who gives back. So one of the biggest, I think, mistakes that an agency can make when you think about these three different types, these three different groups in volunteer policing, is underestimating how important it is to have leaders from within the group lead it. There are many agencies that utilize full-time and don't have any rank at all for volunteers. And that can work. It can work in many different agencies. But I have seen in my personal experience that the individuals who are uh, within a unit that has leaders that they know are going through the same thing that they're going through, have the same time limits on their lives, have the same volunteering mindset, it really helps to empower the unit to be more than just a group of people and rather can work together. Reserve leaders do a lot more than just manage schedules. They have to set the culture of the agency. They have to mentor. They have to enforce the standards that the agency has. And they really act as the connective tissue between the volunteers and the full-time personnel and the full-time leadership. Um, I've also seen how different command philosophies can shape or unshape um, volunteer programs. When the leadership portion is ignored by senior level full-time people, I see that often the problems that will come up in the unit, they don't disappear. They move up the organization and they get to that top level and they become problems for everyone at the senior leadership level. But when you have a reserve leadership that is strong, it's able to absorb that. It's able to make decisions and answer questions and handle things earlier in the process, and the unit doesn't become a problem to the senior leadership. Um, as I mentioned before, some volunteers have full arrest powers. Some even have powers when off duty, while others have very limited authority or have none at all. And this can carry real implications for the agency. What I always say is that you need to make sure that whatever your volunteer officers are doing, they should meet the standards of the job that they're performing through training. So they need to have the training for what they're doing. So if they're not doing law enforcement, they don't need to have law enforcement powers. But if they're doing first aid, if they're responsible for first aid, then they should have first aid training, as an example. From a leadership perspective, maybe you don't need to have identical training in every case. You need to make sure that those volunteers are appropriately trained for the duties that they're going to perform, and credibility as a leader when you are working with different levels of training within your own unit, maybe, is how consistent you are on making sure that the reserves you have or the volunteers that you have are really held to the standards for the job that they're doing, and making sure that they complete the training as it's required. One thing that's important to recognize about volunteering is that the people who are out there, they're not out there to make a paycheck. It's not paycheck compliance. It's not showing up to work because they have to. It's because they really are service driven. But you have to have accountability, and you have to be, as a volunteer leader, you have to be adaptable. It's extremely important as a leader of a policing organization. So to wrap up, I'm not going to take a lot more time. I hope we'll have some time at the end where we can answer some questions in the chat. I think that's how we're doing it, right, Ian, is questions in the chat. Volunteer policing is a long-standing and very significant part of policing, both in the U.S. and internationally. It has real benefits. but it also can raise important questions about training, authority, cost, and organizational integration. And those things are what your volunteer leaders can help the agency through. Um, Based on both my academic work and my experience leading a large metropolitan reserve unit, I would argue that volunteer policing is neither a shortcut to policing, nor is it a relic. It is important for today. It is important uh, to be tied to your community. So when an organization is led well, when it's engaged by command staff and strong reserve leadership, it strengthens agencies and communities. So having said all that, I'd just like to add one thing before I turn it over to Joe, and that is I hope that our listeners today are members of the Volunteer Law Enforcement Officer Alliance, and if not, I hope you'll consider joining. And I know you're probably going to say that later, Iain, but I wanted to put the plug in now. Joe?
Okay. Well, first of all, I would agree with everything that you two have said already in every aspect. And actually, you stole a little bit of my thunder, but I'll do some reinforcing. And I want to start out with thanking everyone here that are volunteers that give their time to affect their community and their organization. It truly, truly does make a difference. A little real quick background on me. I've had the opportunity to serve in the Phoenix Police Department for over 45 years. I was born on the department, so I mean, I started like when I was 5. Okay, we don't talk about age. And Ross, we want to congratulate you. I guess it's a congratulations on your many, many years of volunteerism and selflessness of serving your community. And we're glad you're involved, and we look forward to your continued involvement. Because it takes people with your life experiences and all those that are listening to really impact the volunteer in policing. As we talk about leadership and we talk about integration, integration often is governed by policy, agency policy, and governed by, in some situations, the state laws or the laws of the land, reference to the authority. You've heard, like Ross talked about, many agencies have full authority police officers that have the same rights and duties and responsibilities as their career peers, and others have some limited authority. It really doesn't matter with your program. And I also believe that rules and policies can be influenced by effective leadership within the reserve programs. I think one of the key things to affect your reserve program is ensuring that your reserve program has value and benefit to the community you serve and to the organization. Like with Ross, working with so many different sheriffs over the years, and their individual take on and utilization of reserves varies. And finding ways to provide a value and a benefit to the organization and particularly the leadership, the career leadership, be it a sheriff or a police chief or what do you call them, Iain? Chief constables. Is that right? Having some type of value is critical. And that's where we, as leadership within the reserve programs, can affect the reserve program and how it's received, perceived, and then at times utilized. So I've come up with a few things. And one is, and actually it's going to reinforce what Ross said, is training. We need to ensure that whatever duties we have, and you just said it, that you're training in to the level of what you're being utilized in. So if you're a full authority police officer, we need to, as leaders within the reserves, and need to ensure that our volunteers rise to that level. They have the competencies, they have the training and skills to perform their duties at a very acceptable level. If it's a limited authority, high visibility, used for special events, every one of those positions require, and in today's world, I would say everyone, even in limited authority situations, really play a key role in safety. The eyes and the ears of your career peers in identifying potential hazards. That's just an example. Rise to that level. So your training and competencies, and also understanding of policies and procedures. in policing. Nowadays, there's a lot of guidelines and rules of engagement, and we need to make sure we understand that so that we have those skills. Second idea is being there when you're needed. A very strong resource. And I'll speak personally of within our organization. We've had, like, for example, we had I won't say last minute, but we had a marathon that was put on our organization to run and coordinate. 196 positions. We were able to staff 35 of them with reserves. Did that provide value to the organization? Absolutely. Did it provide a resource to them? Yes. Did our people play key roles? It was interesting. They played not only from traffic control and crowd control, but actually undercover operations to infiltrate the group to look for suspicious activities, a wide variety of functions. But be there for the organization. Again, it provides value. Another thing that I think, Ross, you might have hit on too is developing those relationships within all ranks, and not only within internally. So as we lead our people, and I agree that the structured, having a structured leadership and leading from within the reserve programs is critical, so that we can help our people and help train them and oversee them, and accountability to ensure they meet the requirements. That's important. So those relationships are important. But I think the relationships with our career peers, whatever the rank and situation they're in, one of the things that we strongly encourage our reserve officers to do is to have that relationship with their career supervisor. Because we've structured it to where all of our reserves actually have two supervisors. They have a career supervisor and a reserve supervisor. Reserve more administratively, career more operationally. But it's the criticalness is developing those relationships. And when you have those relationships and there's a value to that relationship, there's more opportunities for our people to serve, and very unique, totally integrated opportunities to serve. And then finally, I think a key is, I don't like this word, and Dr. Wolf, maybe you can come up with more of a creative word for me on this, but marketing. You know what? You have to let people know what you do. You said it, Ross, you made the comment that, and I suspect with our viewers, they would share the same feelings that you and I have and Iain have about the integration of reserves, and that is, people are surprised. You have professionals that might be a lawyer, a professor, a teacher, a baker, whatever, and they volunteer their time to be a full-fledged police officer to support and help their community be safe. But if you don't tell people, they never know. And I think in a lot of environments, some environments, maybe not all, but like in our environment, if a reserve officer responded to a call for service from a citizen, a resident, they would know the difference between a career officer and a reserve officer. That's a great thing. But you also have to tell them that you did it. You have to let them know, hey, we filled 35 positions on a marathon of 190 positions, or whatever we do, they need to know. So we have to make sure we tell them. The old adage, if you don't tell someone you did it, it never happened. That perception is real, and you're not saying it to brag or to boast, but you're saying it to reinforce the value that you have and the benefit that you have within the organization. So as leaders, all of us here participating in this webinar, we need to focus. So I would recommend that we focus on training, ensure our staff is competent, that we make sure that we're responsive to the needs of the organization when they ask for help, within reason. When somebody, we're volunteers, and some of us are quasi-retired, some of us aren't, Ross, but so we have personal times when we can be there, make sure we're there, develop those relationships, and when we do stuff, develop a structure that it's integrated within the career side, that it's reported. For example, I know we have a few people participating in this webinar today, and it will be reported to actually the chief knows we're doing it. And if you don't tell the chief, if we hadn't advertised and sent that cool flyer that you made, Ian, that advertising it, sending it to our executive level people, they would have never known. It adds value. Again, continually find ways to add value. Um, your slide, Ian, that talks about good practices, I would encourage you. Hopefully you can share that with everyone, because I think those are sound guidelines and suggestions that we can take. I can tell you personally that our chief and the executive staff will get is going to get a copy of that and say, this is why we're successful, because I looked at your list of good practices and I think we're in line. Others that didn't see it, hopefully you can look at it and maybe find ways to integrate that into your program. Um, uh, and then there was another, um, there's something else, but I lost it. I'm sorry. I was going to quote you on something, Ross. But anyway, so I would tell you, it's exciting. It's fun to be a reserve. Personally, I did a 35 and a half year career as a career person, and then had the opportunity to stay and been involved for the last 10 years. And in fact, one of the people watching today, one of our reserves, he's been with the Phoenix Police Department for 55 years, Henry Cousin. And here's a man that brings legacy, and he brings uh, organizational history, credibility, and the value. So all of you out there that are listening play a key role in the leadership. So, and it's great to be here. And this is a great forum. I hope we can continue with it. And I too would encourage, get involved like you already are as a volunteer, but get involved in helping other agencies. In my years of experience, I find that policing has lots of similarities, and this is really cool with this group here. I've had the opportunity to be exposed internationally, and doggone if it's not the same, folks. We are in this together, and we share so many things in common. We're not unique in any way. The challenges that Ross had in his organization, or I have, or others have, it's the same. And collectively, we can come together and come up with suggestions. And more importantly, we can recruit more people, because volunteering in our communities is an amazing opportunity. So I appreciate that. And thank you, Ian, and Ben, thank you for the leadership you're providing right now. So it's all back to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Joe, and to Ross before. I think beyond the takeaways, for 55 years of service is absolutely incredible, and also that running marathons in Arizona is quite incredible. But I think what comes over is in part what you were saying right at the end there, that despite the variability that Ross was talking about, that we have very different programs, very different roles in terms of authority in different agencies, what you discover when you look around the world is so much in common. But when you look at the leadership challenges and structures and issues and dynamics in different agencies around volunteer police, you can look at a conversation around that in Florida or Arizona or in the UK or in the Netherlands, and so much of this is resonant in all of those different places and different programs. I think at the moment we would encourage people to put any questions you have into the Q&A section, which is hopefully working okay. At the moment we have one from Ingrid. Hi, Ingrid. You mentioned the issues with various groups of people not knowing that volunteer policing even exists or what it entails. I think this is also getting to this. This was based on what Ross was saying, but very much gets into Joe's point of, if people don't know about it, if you're not telling people it's happening. But basically, the question, which I guess over to you and Ross and Joe, is: have you seen any good examples of initiatives, events, other things which help to address this problem? So getting out there what volunteering is and what it does.
You want me to go first, Joe? Okay. First of all, I have to say that it's probably one of the more frustrating things of my career has been working very hard to get the word out about volunteer policing, and maybe not as much, but certainly almost as much, finding that people aren't aware that volunteer police exist. When I say that, I'm talking about, general citizenry, but also sometimes even within my own policing agency, you run across once in a while on a scene, you walk up to someone and you're talking to them for a second or two about whatever the issue is that you're dealing with, and they say, "Where do you work?" "Oh, I'm a reserve." "What's a reserve?" And you have to start from the beginning. So even though this is something that, as Ingrid mentioned, is something that I thought we've done some really good work on getting the word out, it's still sometimes aggravating. So let me start with that. But I do think that there are a lot of agencies, and I'm going to give kudos to Joe in Phoenix right now, because I do watch them. I follow Phoenix Reserves, and your foundation that you have done some really great work in getting the word out about um, reserves in Phoenix. Um, Kudos to you for that. I think that some of the other initiatives are internal, that you really have to work with your internal folks. So you could use your volunteer police to be your marketers, using Joe's word of marketing. But I think it's even more effective to have your agency marketers talking about your reserve, because then it shows that they see you as important too. And so I think when you want to talk about good examples of initiatives or events or other things, as you mentioned in your question, Ingrid, I think that without the help of your agency, it's going to be an uphill battle. It can be done, but it's going to be an uphill battle. So let me start with that, and then I'll hand it over to Joe.
You know what? I totally agree. And it has to be collaborative. Um, and you have to, let me give you an example. We have in our department, we have a unit, it's a career unit, it's a public affairs bureau, and they have a administrator or commander over that bureau. And unfortunately, we have a relationship and stuff. And unfortunately, she would always often say, "Well, Joe, why didn't you tell me about that? We would have marketed it." Last couple of weeks ago, we have a weekly newsletter that goes out to every employee within the Phoenix Police Department, and then actually goes over to city management and stuff. And as a result of that relationship that we have with our career marketers, our career people within the organization, we actually had end of the year. So far, we're on track on the fiscal year of donating over 52,000 hours. That marketer, the career marketer, when we were talking about that in a staff meeting, caught that, and on her own put us on the front page of the newspaper, newsletter. The foundation we have a cool Camaro. If y'all want to come out and visit, we'll take you out to the driving track in our Camaro. Hopefully our admin sergeant isn't listening to that, but it's become sort of the highlight of it's a recruitment Camaro. But that was on the front page, and they talked about what the reserves do and everything else. Isn't it crazy? And I suspect, Ross, those that are listening have the same issues that we have. And what's a reserve? Our reserve program's been around for over 100 years, and you still get it. What's a reserve? And you want to say, what? How's that happen? But so that way, that's one way internally. I totally agree with Ross. Develop those relationships and have the career people be your key advocates, be your spokesperson. And then in the community, make sure that your decision makers, however they may be. I'll give you one example. Our mayor is very aware of our program, and she was having lunch with a gentleman who happens to be a lobbyist, and he was sort of jabbing her about staffing, police staffing, which we all suffer. And he was giving her a hard time about, what are you going to do about this, mayor? And the mayor turns and says, well, we have a reserve program. Why don't you join it? Believe it or not, that gentleman joined the reserve, did 11-month academy, and now is a police officer with us. I use that as an illustration, just as make sure everyone is aware of who you are. And then it becomes self-perpetuating. Our tradition, we call them traditional reserves. Those are those professional people. we call them traditional reserves. They're the best representation because they go to their friends and tell their friends. You wouldn't believe what I did over the weekend while you guys were out doing whatever. I was out and I did this call and this call and this call. So the key is consciously with a strategy, and I think Iain, you talked about being strategic in what we do. Develop a plan, and part of that plan needs to be internal and external, and then put some meat to that plan, and have a plan of, hey, I plan to do this. I plan to intentionally, if a reserve does something good in a particular work unit, send the career commander or the career leadership person a little note and said, hey, did you know that Henry did this, and this is the outcome. Again, they need to know what we do. We do great stuff. So that's just some ideas. Develop a strategic plan, and then have your, seek others to help you with it.
Thank you very much. We're now going to enter the quick fire round because we have enough four questions come in. So this is the fingers on the buzzers or whatever the quiz show equivalent is. So firstly, Amanda asks just any key tips for recruitment. Do either of you want to pick up that quickly?
Recruitment, again, it's I think just letting people know it's amazing the number of people who want to serve in this type of capacity, in public safety type of capacity. What we found from our traditional reserves is that they've always wanted to be in law enforcement, or they always wanted to participate. Make sure they know they have that opportunity. Be willing to reach outside the norm and go to businesses and community meetings, and then tell them what the reserve program is. Have a real quick program. When people do recruitment, we recruit for career and we recruit for reserves. What fits you best?
I'm going to add one thing to that, Iain. I know we're in a speed round. Make sure your agency is on board with what it takes to process any applications you get and hire those people on, because oftentimes agencies are much more focused on hiring the full-time people, especially in today's day and age. So, to make recruitment work, you have to make sure that they're going to be there to back you up.
True.
Yeah. Excellent. I can probably answer the next one. Simon, lovely to see you on the call, wants to know if there's any success in standardizing leadership models across volunteer officers, across different agencies. I think my short answer is we don't have a lot of success in standardizing anything across agencies in terms of volunteer policing, and leadership is part of that. And I only wish, clearly the whole concept of the VLEOA is bringing us together to try to share the best and learn from one another and start to connect together, I guess.
Can I add to that too,
Okay.
Iain? Just real quick. I think that one of the benefits of this organization, as you said, is to talk about these things, but also, just the fact that leadership often changes the leadership structure of the reserve unit, because some new sheriff will say, well, we need, a major to run the unit, and this is what we want to do. And then a new sheriff come in, or a new chief, and say something else. So, in the US anyway, it's a problem with the leadership has to understand, as Joe said earlier, what the unit does in order to keep it, to keep the leadership successful. Sorry, I keep adding little things. I'm taking up all your time. Go ahead.
We're fine. We're doing the quick fire round well here, I think. Next question from Mike, the lead for the reserve unit in LASD. Hi, Mike. Hope you're well. I think what he's saying basically is that the reserves are becoming more and more important. The issues of staffing shortages, obviously the upcoming World Cup, and then through to the 2028 Olympic Games. Current strength of 435 reserves, which is really, really impressive, and saying that retiring deputies are solid to that growth. And Mike's saying that they currently pay reserves around special events and in some contexts, and was just curious what payment is made to reserves in other organizations. I think that is probably quite a specifically US context. I think the answer is probably nothing at all in terms of payment to reserve programs in most countries around the world, but in the US it very much is a thing with off duty in some contexts, isn't it? Do you, Ross
Um,
or Joe, want to just quickly
I'll jump in
pick up
first and let
anything on
Joe
that?
go. I'll let Joe go after I do, because he's going to be different, I'm sure. Mostly, even though you said in the US we might pay, if it's something for staffing needs in my agency, 99% of the time it's done on volunteer basis anyway. There is no pay in my agency. Um, with there is one exception that we have in my agency, and how they pay is based on the lowest paid salary of a deputy sheriff. Um, it doesn't matter your rank. That's what you get paid for the one event that we do pay reserves to assist with. We do have off-duty pay. That's a different thing. But for operational needs of the agency, it's 99% of the time it's on a volunteer basis. So Joe?
Same. Well, actually, ours is by city ordinances that we cannot get paid. Um, and the lawyers would say that if you do get paid, it comes close to FSLA rules of volunteering for something you get paid for. But we are like you, Ross, where we do get off duty, where you can work special events in an off duty capacity, and get paid, which is a motivator for a lot of people. So, Mike, hey, reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you more about that, because that's a real big issue.
And our final question, conscious we're slightly over time. Bonnie Gosling says, interesting presentation. Interested in what the baseline measures used to determine whether a volunteer candidate is suitable for police work around things like psychological and attitude screening, ensuring people are there for the right reasons. I think if I pick up that, my experience around the world in different programs is generally that sort of screening, vetting, assessment process is pretty much mirror between paid service and volunteer contexts, like for like, that there isn't a lesser level of screening or a lesser level of psychological testing or whatever, but basically those sorts of assessments for people coming into the law enforcement environment are very even between sort of volunteer and paid roles. But I don't know if Ross or Joe, you have anything to add?
100%. Our processing for reserves is identical to processing for full-time. Obviously, errors are made once in a while in selection of candidates, but that could happen for a full-time candidate as much as it could for a volunteer.
100%. And I would caution ever trying to compromise. The expectation of the community is the same for volunteers as it is for paid, and we can't compromise. We have to have the same quality of people with the same purposes.
Thank you very much. Well, if I bring things to a close with apologies for brief overrun by a couple of minutes, but just to give huge thanks to Ross and to Joe for sharing their massive experience of leading in terms of volunteer policing and giving us a really interesting session tonight, very much from the reality of actually leading their own organizations. So thank you thank you very much. And also thank you to everyone for listening in and for the questions. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar we'll schedule in a couple of months' time.
Perfect. Thank you.
Join
Bye-bye.
join VLEOA if you aren't
Absolutely.
already a member. All right. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.